This isn't the Wild West you saw in movies. This is the version they didn't want you to know. A fog rolls over Deadwood, thick and sour with the smell of horses, gun oil, and someone's forgotten bottle of cheap whiskey. You move slowly down the cracked wooden boardwalk, the boards groaning under your boots, like they know you're not from here. Lantern light bleeds from a crooked saloon doorway, and inside, laughter rattles against the glass like a bullet looking for a reason. There's a woman at the bar who doesn't quite fit. Rough spun shirt, battered hat, a scowl that could etch glass. You don't see a dress anywhere near her, but you do see the holster. And the way people make space when she walks past. That's not respect, that's learned survival. You're looking at Calamity Jane. Not the version scrubbed clean by Hollywood, the one with Doris Day's teeth and Broadway songs. No, you're staring at the one who dragged sick men out of smallpox tents with bare, scarred hands, who could drink half the town under the table and still shoot straighter than most sober soldiers. You're not supposed to know about her. You're supposed to believe she was a sidekick, a footnote, a novelty. But tonight, you're going to walk beside her through the muddy streets of history. And you're going to realize, Calamity Jane wasn't just a sharpshooter. She was the chaos and compassion of the American frontier wrapped in one battered body. And, to be fair, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments. Let's see who else is wandering the Wild West with us tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in Deadwood the way everyone did, half lost and a little desperate. The year's somewhere between gunfights and gold rushes. The hills echo with pickaxes and pistol shots. And somewhere in the thick of it, a woman named Jane is carving her legend into the bones of the Badlands. But long before she slung a rifle over her shoulder and spat in the eye of polite society, she had a different name. Martha Jane Canary, born in Missouri in 1852, at least according to some half-credible records. But if you're expecting a tidy birth certificate and a photo album, you're about to be disappointed. Even the census clerks couldn't pin her down. Was it 1852 or 1856? Princeton or Nevada? Missouri? Historians still argue whether her name was even originally spelled Canary or Canary. That's the thing about Jane, she comes wrapped in contradictions. What we do know is this: her parents died early. Her childhood evaporated faster than prairie rain, and by age 12 or 13, she was hauling her younger siblings westward in a covered wagon. That's not childhood, that's command. Picture it: endless plains, creaking wheels, dust in your teeth, and nothing but the threat of starvation and sickness to guide you. You're a teenage girl becoming head of a broken family. No time for school, no time for play, just grit, horses, and the gnawing fear that today might be the day the axle breaks or the water runs dry. She landed eventually in Wyoming territory. Not exactly the vacation spot. Rough camps, mining towns, saloons stacked like rotten teeth along muddy roads. And somewhere along the way, young Martha Jane began morphing into something else. She ditched skirts for trousers, braided her hair back like a cavalry scout, and started going by a new name, one no one would forget: Calamity Jane. The Calamity part, she claimed it came from saving a captain's life during an Indian skirmish, earning the title Heroine of the Plains. But historians still argue whether that tale was real or just another whiskey-soaked embellishment. Knowing Jane, it's probably both. You'd think she'd shy away from attention, but Jane chased it like a dog after a runaway stagecoach. She exaggerated, bragged, and dared anyone to challenge her stories. One minute she was rescuing a soldier from a Sioux ambush, the next, she was getting kicked out of town for drunkenness and indecency. You try reconciling that. But here's the thing, they couldn't ignore her, because underneath the bluster and the benders was someone you wanted on your side when the shooting started. She wasn't pretending to be tough. She was tough, and in a world where women were expected to keep quiet and so She was galloping headfirst into battles. Sometimes literally. And don't get comfortable thinking she was just following the army around. Cooking beans. No, Jane was riding shotgun on supply wagons, outpacing male scouts, and shooting buffalo for sport and survival. Picture a 5-foot-something woman with mud on her boots and a rifle across her lap, spitting tobacco juice and daring you to tell her she couldn't be there. She was there. She was always there. Fringe tidbit for you. She reportedly once rode 90 miles in a blizzard just to deliver news to a remote outpost. Didn't even stop to warm up. Just rode through sleet and near death like it was another Tuesday. And when she showed up in Deadwood, that place had already seen its share of outlaws and opportunity seekers. But Jane fit in like a bullet in a chamber. People laughed, gossiped, recoiled, but they remembered her. You don't forget a woman who drinks like a cavalryman, swears like a miner, and nurses plague victims with her bare hands. You especially don't forget her when she walks into a saloon with a shotgun and tells the barkeep to shut up and pour. Some say she was a sideshow, a clown in boots, but you're beginning to see the truth, aren't you? She wasn't a joke. She was a storm system in human form, equal parts mercy and menace. And unlike most dime novel heroes, she didn't ride off into the sunset. She rode deeper into the dirt. And just as you start to wonder how a girl from nowhere ended up out shooting soldiers and rewriting every rule of womanhood on the frontier, a voice whispers through the fog. She wasn't born wild. She had to be. You can't sleep on the plains. The wind doesn't let you. It moans through the grass, low and long, like a tired animal hunting something lost. Coyotes yip just out of view, and the stars above burn colder than any fire can fix. You're huddled in a canvas tent with dirt for a pillow, and somewhere not far off, a girl named Martha Jane Canary is trying to remember what her mother looked like. She's no one yet, not Calamity, not even Jane, just Martha, child of Robert and Charlotte Canary, two settlers with big dreams and poor luck. Born, maybe, in 1852, in Princeton, Missouri, or was it 1856? The records blur like the horizon. Her mother dies young, consumption most likely, and her father keeps moving west, dragging 6 kids behind him like rattling tin cans on a wagon axle. Martha is the oldest. By 13, she's mother, cook, scout, protector. Her father dies somewhere near Salt Lake City, and that's when the last threads snap. Now it's just her and her siblings. Some she manages to keep with her. Others vanish into foster homes, work crews, maybe worse. And through it all, she hardens, not cruel, just armored. This is where the myth starts, not in a saloon shootout, but in the slow grind of survival with no safety net and no help coming. You try hitching oxen to a wagon with blood on your knuckles from splitting kindling wrong. You try bartering with traders who call you girl like it's an insult and refuse to look you in the eye. You try watching your youngest brother cough all night beside a campfire and realize the closest doctor is 3 days' ride and probably drunk. That's where she came from. No cavalry bugles, no grand entrance, just dirt, loss, and the kind of hunger you don't shake. Even decades later, historians still argue whether she was raised rough or just liked to say so. But even skeptics admit this. She didn't come from privilege. She came from the wagon trail, what one historian called America's slowest meat grinder. And she walked into it barefoot and unarmed. Well, not for long. By the time she was 15, Martha was doing what frontier girls simply didn't. Working as a bullwhacker. Which means driving oxen and mules. Sometimes up to 20 hours a day. She learned to spit tobacco juice for distance, curse like a prospector, and shoot just about anything with legs. You can still smell the black powder if you focus, thick, acrid, and clinging to her sleeves. And here's your quirky tidbit. One old-timer claimed she once wrestled a mule into a river crossing by grabbing its ear and biting it. Probably an exaggeration, but with Jane, you never quite know. She didn't grow up, she adapted. In a time when girls were being taught embroidery and piano, Martha Jane was skinning rabbits, loading rifles, and memorizing every back trail between Missouri and Montana. She wasn't just acting tough. She had to be tough. No one was going to rescue her. So she learned to ride, to fight, to lie, and, most importantly, to endure. Imagine the ache in her shoulders at night after a day of driving wagons across terrain that had no road. Just the memory of a buffalo herd. Imagine the wind carving your cheeks raw while you push forward because falling behind means someone doesn't eat. Somewhere along that trail, she stopped flinching when people stared. That's when the clothes changed. Dresses were a hazard, and modesty didn't outrank mobility. She started wearing buckskins and trousers, practical, scandalous, and oddly fashionable in a defiant sort of way. She'd later tell people she disguised herself to join the army as a scout. And while it's hard to know if that's entirely true, there were reports of a young woman riding with male soldiers in the Dakota Territory, handling herself just fine. That's also when her name started shifting. Not quite Calamity yet, but whispers of Jane started circling around campfires. It was easier to remember, easier to fear. She wasn't looking for fame, but she was looking for something. Safety, control, maybe just a place where she didn't have to explain why her hands were calloused and her voice deeper than expected. The frontier didn't care. It didn't ask. It just took. And Jane kept offering herself to it like a dare. You start to get the feeling that her story wasn't supposed to be told. Not this way. Anyway, the real version isn't cinematic. It's chapped lips, broken teeth, and constant motion. She didn't stand still long enough to be photographed until years later. And when she did, she looked half defiant, half exhausted. But even in those early days, Jane knew the power of story. When people asked about her past, she'd give different answers depending on her mood. One day she'd say she was the daughter of a rich Southern family who ran off to join the war. Another day, she'd claim she was kidnapped by Indians and raised like a warrior. Most likely, neither was true, but who's to say what parts of herself she was trying to bury beneath those lies? Some say she was ashamed of her beginnings. Others say she just loved a good yarn. But deep down, you suspect it's both. She needed her legend to carry her when her real life got too heavy. We all do, sometimes. So, here she is, teenage Martha Jane, standing on the edge of womanhood. Boots caked in mud, heart scarred and stitched, eyes hard, no parents, no map, no softness left in her life except maybe the vague hope that tomorrow doesn't kill her. She doesn't know it yet, but people will one day name saloons and highways after her. Little girls will dress up like her for Halloween. Tourists will pay to see the rusty revolvers they think she used. But tonight, she's just a kid on a trail, watching the stars and wondering how many more days she has to survive before someone calls her something that sticks. Jane, she whispers to herself, just to test how it feels. The wind answers with a cold breath. You wake up in motion. The wagon rattles beneath you, bouncing over rocks like bones under burlap. The wheels creak like they're telling secrets, and every jolt feels like a slap from the road itself. Dust finds your eyes, your teeth, your thoughts, and somewhere nearby, Martha Jane Canary, now a young woman, clicks her tongue at a stubborn mule and tightens her grip on the reins. You're not a traveler, you're freight. This land doesn't coddle passengers. And Jane, she's long past being carried. She's pulling her weight and then some. Part of a military caravan cutting its way through Dakota Territory in the mid-1870s. Her days of childhood are distant ghosts now, barely worth the remembering. Now she's hauling army supplies and trailing behind General Custer's expeditions, yes. That Custer, along with a ragtag fleet of scouts, teamsters, and soldiers too hungover to salute. She's not technically enlisted, not officially on the payroll, but she's there, and the officers aren't arguing, because when you've got someone who can handle a 6-mule team, patch a busted axle, and shoot a coyote clean through the skull without breaking stride, you don't ask for her birth certificate. Historians still argue whether Jane truly served as a military scout under Custer or merely followed along as a contracted teamster. Some documents name her, others ignore her completely. That's the thing with unofficial women in official wars. They get erased unless they bleed out publicly. But the stories, say plenty. One tale has her outpacing a group of male scouts in a race across the Badlands, galloping 50 miles in under 8 hours to deliver critical messages. Another describes her stepping in when a team of soldiers panicked during a standoff with native warriors, firing her rifle with unnerving calm as the young privates shook like leaves. Then there's the time she reportedly stood off a small band of Cheyenne attackers with only a shotgun, 3 shells, and pure spite. That one probably got embellished. Probably, but you wouldn't bet against it. Quirky detail incoming. During one brutal march, Jane supposedly rigged a tent out of mule hides and whiskey barrels when a blizzard hit camp unexpectedly. It collapsed on the cook, but the stew inside was still hot. And no one died, so it's chalked up as a win. That's how the army remembers her, not as a hero or a villain, but as a bizarrely reliable problem solver with a drinking problem and a heart that confused everyone. She was crass, loud, loyal to a fault, and somehow always nearby when something exploded. But here's the part that sticks with you. She wasn't just surviving these expeditions. She was choosing them, again and again. The danger, the chaos, the stink of gunpowder and sweat. It gave her something nothing else had, a role. A reason. When you've been unwanted for most of your life, being needed, even temporarily, feels like oxygen. And maybe she liked the adrenaline, the pace, the idea that every sunrise could be your last and that no one expected you to embroider anything. Ever. She wasn't just out of place in a woman's world. She'd opted out. But even among soldiers, she stood out. The uniform helped. Jane often wore a version of a cavalry outfit, modified with whatever fit and didn't chafe during long rides. The hat was always tilted just so, and her rifle was never far from reach. She didn't strut like some dime novel cowboy. She walked like someone who had carried dead things on her back. Still, most men didn't know what to make of her. They laughed when she cursed like a deckhand and downed whiskey like she was trying to drown something. They flinched when she aimed without blinking. And they stared when, at night, she'd hum lullabies to the fire while polishing her saddle. Not every soldier liked her, but nearly all of them respected her. Or feared her, or both. You wouldn't want to fight her, but you would want her on your side when the bullets started flying. Then came the day the wagons were ambushed outside Goose Creek. Accounts vary, as they often do when people are shouting, but the core of the story goes like this. Jane's column was hit by native warriors, possibly Cheyenne, possibly Lakota, and in the chaos, an officer named Captain Egan took a shot to the shoulder. Jane reportedly rode straight into the fray, lifted him onto her horse, and hauled him to safety while returning fire. That's the version she told. Anyway, it's also the origin of her famous nickname. From that day on, she would later write in her memoir, "I was known as Calamity Jane." Of course, not everyone bought that. Some claimed she invented the story whole cloth. Others said she earned the name by simply being the walking embodiment of bad luck. If Jane showed up, something bad was bound to happen soon after. But even the skeptics admit, it stuck. Calamity wasn't just a nickname. It was branding. It set her apart, gave her shape. The world now had to reckon with her myth whether they liked it or not. And she leaned into it. Once the name caught on, she wore it like armor, something between satire and shield. Calamity Jane wasn't a person. She was a storm warning, a swaggering, pistol-toting middle finger to Victorian femininity. And under all the bravado, maybe a frightened girl still trying to prove she deserved to exist. You ride alongside her now, and the road feels less like a journey and more like a dare. Every horizon is a challenge. Every river crossing, a gamble. You hear her curse as a wheel breaks. See her grin as she ties it back together with rope and nerve. And suddenly, the idea of frontier spirit makes a little more sense. She's not just surviving, she's refusing to quit. And for now, that's enough. You find her crouched beside a campfire, sharpening a knife that's already sharp enough. The blade gleams in the light like it has stories to tell. Jane doesn't speak unless she has to. There's a rifle leaning on a tree stump nearby, and her hat's pulled low. But even in this dim quiet, you see the steel in her spine. She's wearing a uniform that doesn't quite fit, not tailored, not issued, but claimed. Cavalry trousers tucked into scuffed boots. A military coat patched with pieces of canvas and memory. Jane wears it like a second skin. A flag of defiance against the roles stitched for women. You stopped seeing her as strange. Out here, she makes more sense than most. The year's somewhere in the mid-1870s. The frontier is still bleeding from the Civil War. And the government's building railroads and reputations across land that doesn't belong to them. In that dust and moral murk, Jane moves with confidence, half soldier, half ghost. She doesn't need a title to know her value. Historians still argue whether Jane was formally enlisted in any military campaign. Some say she was hired as a scout during General Crook's Yellowstone expedition. Others insist she simply showed up and didn't leave. Either way, she got away with it. And more importantly, she was good at it. A sharpshooter, a scout, a survivalist. She could read terrain like some folks read music. She had a hunter's sense of movement, always knowing when danger was near before anyone else did. She wasn't fast on the trigger, she was right. Here's your historical nugget. In 1875, the US military was increasingly dependent on civilian scouts, native and white, for navigating unknown terrain. It wasn't unheard of for women to tag along with soldiers. But Jane wasn't there to cook stew. She was there to point where the bullets were coming from. And that confused people, especially the men in charge. She rode and drank and cursed like a soldier, but she didn't sleep in the men's tents. She didn't line up at parade. She hovered between roles, always useful, never official, a wild card with a rifle and a story for every scar. Then there was the shooting. Now, don't get caught up in dime novel nonsense. She wasn't flipping pistols like some Wild West anime, but she could shoot, and she liked to, whether it was for food, defense, or sheer release. Jane handled a rifle with the kind of comfort that made people nervous. One Army quartermaster once said she could put 3 rounds into a knothole at 40 yards and still have time to insult your horse. Probably embellished, but again, probably not by much. Quirky tidbit. According to one Wagoneer's diary, Jane once won a shooting contest by hitting a tossed silver dollar midair, then promptly used the same dollar to buy a round of drinks and spill half of it on the table while laughing. Best day's work that coin ever did, she said, but the rifle wasn't just for show. It was survival. In Indian Territory, in Montana's endless badlands, in the craggy edges of Wyoming, being able to hit a target meant you ate. You lived, or your traveling party didn't get wiped out. And Jane wasn't interested in being a victim. Her skill with a firearm became part of her persona, an extension of the myth she was building in real time. People whispered about her in towns long before she arrived. That woman who outshot 3 men in Cheyenne. That scout who rides like the devil and drinks like a priest on payday. That, what do you even call her? She didn't fit in drawers. You couldn't categorize her, and when you tried, she'd just change again. Even her voice didn't match expectations. Gravelly, low, not melodious or meek. One reporter described it as the sound of boots dragging through sand, and honestly, that feels about right. But it wasn't just her shooting that made her infamous. It was the fact that she didn't seem to care who judged her for it. That's the part that left people speechless. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She just was. You try walking through a frontier town as a woman in pants and a rifle on your hip. You try pushing past the stares, the slurs, the slow mutters of, "That ain't proper." Jane didn't flinch. She'd spit tobacco at their boots and tell them to keep walking. In her own way, Jane was playing a dangerous game, presenting as masculine enough to be accepted in male spaces. While never fully hiding her femininity, she didn't deny being a woman. She simply refused to be the kind of woman people expected. And that choice, that rebellion, shaped everything. Remember, this was decades before women could vote. before they could legally own property in some territories, before they were allowed to testify in court as equals. Jane bypassed all of that by becoming someone people feared or admired. But never underestimated. She could fight, she could drink, and she could shoot, so they let her be. Even grudgingly. There's a moment you remember, told in a crumpled letter from a soldier who shared a camp with her near the Tongue River. He wrote, "She bathed in the river fully clothed. Told us not to look and dared us if we did. Then came back to the fire, soaked through, and beat us all at cards." You imagine her there now, boots off, pants wet, smoke curling around her hat as she slaps down a straight flush and grins with teeth that haven't seen a dentist in years. Calamity Jane wasn't just performing masculinity. She was rewriting its rules, making space for herself in a world that didn't know what to do with her. So when she fired that rifle, when she picked off a deer with one shot or scared off would-be bandits with a cold glare and a visible holster, she wasn't showing off, she was declaring herself alive. And in a century that had no place for loud, poor, orphaned women with dirty fingernails and no shame, that was its own kind of revolution. You hear the name before you ever see him. Wild Bill Hickok. It rides into your ear like a pistol shot, loud, dramatic, and a little too polished. He's the walking prototype of every Western lawman Hollywood ever painted. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair that flutters poetically in the breeze even when there isn't one. The moment you step into Deadwood saloon, his legend beats you to the bar. And in the corner, halfway through a glass and a dirty joke, sits the woman who would claim him forever. Calamity Jane. Now, to be clear, this isn't a love story. Not the kind you've been sold. Anyway, it's murky, one-sided, and tangled in more myth than facts. But to Jane, it was something, maybe everything. Historians still argue whether Jane and Wild Bill were ever romantically involved. Some say she adored him from afar. Others swear they were briefly lovers. A few even claim they secretly married, though no record has ever surfaced. And Bill never seemed the sentimental type. But Jane, she told anyone who'd listen. He was the only man I ever loved, she once said, and the way she said it, like the sentence hurt, made you believe her. Even if it wasn't true. You probably know Wild Bill as the poker player with aces and eights in his dead hands. But before that, he was a gunfighter, Union spy, lawman, actor, and generally too big for his boots. He'd been everywhere, done everything, and arrived in Deadwood in 1876 with a new wife and a death sentence he didn't know about. Jane was already there, tangled in the town's rough edges, known for her drinking and her uncanny ability to show up when things went sideways. She didn't waste time making friends. But when Bill rode in, she paid attention. She followed him around town like a dusty shadow, never clinging, never begging, just always nearby, helping, hovering, watching, the way a stray dog watches a butcher's cart, not hungry. Exactly, just hoping to matter. Some say she saved his life once during a barroom scuffle. Others say she made it up after the fact. Jane would later insist she nursed him when he was ill, guarded his back, and even warned him not to sit with his back to the door. You know how that story ends. Wild Bill Hickok was shot in the back of the head while holding a pair of aces and eights, forever dubbed the dead man's hand. The shooter was Jack McCall, a nobody who wanted to be remembered. And unfortunately, he succeeded. Jane was crushed. Accounts vary. Some say she was drunk and didn't react until hours later. Others claim she burst into the saloon within minutes, screaming and trying to claw McCall's eyes out. Either way, something in her broke that day. Quirky tidbit. Jane told reporters years later that Bill's last words were about her, that he whispered her name before he died. Problem is, there were multiple witnesses who all agreed Bill never saw it coming and said nothing at all. Still, Jane repeated the story until the end of her life. Because sometimes, the lie is kinder. You start to realize that Jane wasn't in love with the man. Not entirely. She was in love with what he represented, a fellow misfit who'd carved out a place in the rough world. Bill was the only one who saw her, maybe, really saw her, as something more than a freak show. Or maybe she imagined that part. 2. Maybe that's what hurt the most. She carried his memory like a badge. Told his stories, wrote her own autobiography later that was half drenched in grief and half pickled in whiskey. Painting him as her partner, protector, and great lost love. She even claimed they had a child together, a daughter she gave up for adoption. The timelines don't support it, and no child ever surfaced. But Jane clung to the fantasy like it was the only solid thing left in her saddlebag. That's the thing about grief. It doesn't care what's true, it just needs to be. You walk past her now, seated alone on a stump outside Deadwood, staring at a cloudless sky like it owes her something. Her lips move, but there's no sound. Maybe it's a prayer, maybe it's a curse, or maybe she's just whispering his name again, hoping the hills still remember him. Even in her hardest years, drunk, broke, scorned, she defended Wild Bill like it was a holy mission. One reporter asked her late in life if she regretted anything, and she snapped, "Only that I wasn't there fast enough." Of course, not everyone believed her devotion. Some said she used Bill's name for clout, that she clung to his legend like a life raft, that she made herself the widow of a man who never proposed. But even her critics agree, Jane never sought love again. Not really, not like that. And in a world where affection was transactional and men saw women as possessions. Jane's version of romance, loud, loyal, imaginary, was oddly pure. She didn't pine like a poet. She didn't write letters. She just kept showing up. And long after Wild Bill was buried, Jane kept his ghost close. She'd sit by his grave, drunk or sober, telling stories to no one. Some of them were probably true, some weren't, but the pain in her voice never seemed fake. You start to wonder if that's the real story here, not whether Jane and Bill were lovers, but whether she simply needed someone to anchor her in a world that had never let her belong. Maybe Bill didn't love her back, maybe he barely noticed her, but for one brief moment, she let herself believe she was part of something bigger than herself. That someone wanted her, and when that hope got shot through the head in a poker game, Jane never quite recovered. She stayed in Deadwood for a while after, wandering from job to job, saloon to saloon. People started calling her the Woman Scout, then the Frontier Madonna, then the Nuisance. But no matter what name they gave her, she was always his in her mind. And when the town forgot Wild Bill's name, she reminded them, loudly, repeatedly, as though her voice alone could keep his ghost walking. So when you pass her tonight, muttering to the dark, don't interrupt, just listen. She's not talking to you. She's talking to the only man she ever truly let inside. The nights in Deadwood stretch long and mean. You sit under the flickering porch light of a lopsided boarding house, watching shadows drift across muddy streets. Somewhere, a piano plays out of tune. Somewhere else, someone's yelling about a missing horse or a cheating card. The whiskey here doesn't taste like victory, it tastes like forgetting. And right now, Calamity Jane is deep into her second bottle. This is where her legend takes root, where the myth and the mess collide in a town that doesn't care who you were yesterday. Deadwood in the late 1870s is bursting with gold dust, gunpowder, and germs. Lots of germs. And somehow, Jane fits right in. She's not glamorous, not anymore. If she ever was. She stumbles through town with half a hat, a foul mouth, and the kind of confidence that makes people step aside before they even realize they're doing it. By day, she nurses. That's right, nurses. Because during Deadwood's frequent smallpox outbreaks, when others locked the doors or skipped town, Jane stayed. She walked into fever-choked cabins with a rag over her mouth and a bottle of whiskey in one hand and soup in the other. Historians still argue whether she did it out of compassion or penance. Maybe she saw Wild Bill's death as a debt she could never repay. Or maybe, just maybe, she wanted to prove she was more than just a sharpshooter with a hangover. Either way, she took care of the dying, washed their wounds, sat beside them when no one else would, held hands that hadn't felt clean skin in weeks, and when they passed, she buried them, quietly, without asking for thanks. That's the version of Jane they don't put in movies. The one with no rifle, no boots on a bar, just a wet cloth, a coughing patient, and a heart worn down to threads. But don't get too sentimental. The same day she saved a miner's son from choking on his own lungs. She got thrown out of a saloon for throwing a chair at a bartender who looked at her funny. That's the balance Jane lived in, somewhere between saint and saloon brawler. Quirky fact, she once got arrested for riding a horse through town completely nude. Except for a hat and boots. Yelling that she was the Queen of the Dakotas. Some say it was a dare. Others say she was trying to raise money for a sick friend. And some swear it never happened at all. But Deadwood sheriff did record something about public indecency and a missing horse blanket. Either way, Jane was chaotic good before the term existed. She slept where she landed. Sometimes in barns, sometimes in tents, sometimes in jail, and despite the hard living, some people, loved her. Kids especially, they'd follow her around, laughing at her stories and ducking behind her when things got loud. She had a way with children, maybe because she still carried a child-sized wound inside herself. She never bragged about the nursing, never charged for it, just showed up when someone got sick, and left before they could say thank you. There's a story about an Irish woman who came down with the fever. Her husband skipped town. Jane stayed, even after the kids caught it too. She sat with them for days. All three died. Jane buried them with her own hands, then vanished for 2 weeks. When she came back, no one asked where she'd been, but her bottle was half empty, and her eyes looked like winter had moved in behind them. You'd think someone like that would be hated. But Jane was like a storm. You didn't love it, but you respected it. Some townsfolk saw her as a menace, others as a protector. Everyone knew of her, and if someone died in town, they'd whisper, "I hope Jane finds out. She'll see 'em off proper." But by night, when the streets emptied and the gold diggers counted their earnings, Jane drank hard whiskey, mostly, or anything flammable. She'd sit in a corner booth, mumbling to herself, sometimes singing lullabies under her breath, other times swearing at ghosts only she could see. She wore her grief like a second coat, always buttoned to the neck. And when she wasn't drunk, she was talking about Wild Bill. Still, always. You can't blame her. Deadwood wasn't built for healing. It was a bruise that never faded. And Jane, tough as she was, could only take so many hits. There's something haunting about watching her now. She's laughing too loud at a joke no one told. She's pulling a kid off a muddy street just before a stagecoach rattles by. She's brushing blood off her sleeve like it's flour. She's both too much and not enough for this place. And maybe that's why Deadwood never threw her out. It needed someone like Jane, wild, unpredictable, and quietly heroic. Someone who could wrestle death in the morning and pass out under a table by sundown. One day she walks into the sheriff's office, dragging a half-dead man behind her. He's got 3 bullet wounds and a fever that could kill a horse. She slaps the counter and says, "Found him in the hills. He ain't done being a bastard yet." They let her use the back room. She stays with the man for 3 nights, barely sleeping. On the 4th day, he wakes up, coughs, and whispers, "I thought I was in hell." Jane grins. Worse, you're in Deadwood. That's who she was. A storm wrapped in kindness. A disaster with a first aid kit. And the town, it watched, it whispered, it kept her name in its mouth like a splinter it couldn't quite spit out. You walk those streets now and still feel her. In the wind between buildings. In the dirt that never settles. In the back of your mind, where you wonder how someone could be both a walking punchline and a quiet miracle. But that's Jane. Gun smoke by night, mercy by morning, and never apologizing for either. The door swings open with a bang, and there she is again. Calamity Jane, mud-caked boots, hat cocked at a reckless angle, eyes a bit too wild for comfort. Her coat is stained, and she's halfway through a bottle that smells like it was brewed in someone's boot. The saloon crowd stiffens, glasses pause midair, and the piano stops plunking its tired tune. This is just another Tuesday. You learn quickly, when Jane walks in, Something's about to happen. Could be a joke, could be a brawl, could be both. With a side of flying furniture. She doesn't try to make scenes. They just seem to form around her like weather patterns. By now, her reputation has congealed into something strange, equal parts folk hero and town embarrassment. A woman who once nursed smallpox victims is now better known for yelling obscenities from rooftops and challenging men twice her size to fistfights over card games she didn't understand. And still, no one dares laugh at her to her face. Because Jane might be drunk. But she's still Jane. This is the stretch of her life where heroism and humiliation walk hand in hand. Where the line between public spectacle and private pain blurs under a haze of whiskey. And where the question echoes, what do you do with someone too wild to praise and too kind to exile? Historians still argue whether Jane's drinking was always this bad, or if it escalated after Wild Bill's death. She drank before, sure, but now it's something else. Not just indulgence, erosion. Some nights she's lucid, telling stories about buffalo hunts and war trails. Other nights she falls asleep standing, snoring into her own collar, only to wake up swinging at shadows. And still, if someone collapsed on the boardwalk, Jane would be the first to kneel beside them. It's maddening how fast she flips between savior and storm. Take the time she climbed onto a stagecoach mid-run, barefoot, because she thought she heard a child crying inside. There was no child, just a very frightened mule and 3 passengers who would never ride public transport again. She jumped off before the curve and landed face first in a pile of manure. Then stood up, grinned, and yelled, "Told you I'd find the devil." The town laughed for a week. She didn't care, or pretended not to. Then there's the flip side, the times when her drinking turned dangerous. Like when she blacked out in a livery stable and set the hay on fire trying to light a cigar. Or when she accused a preacher of stealing her boots and nearly started a church riot. The boots, it turns out, were still on her feet. Quirky tidbit. Once, she tried to enter a horse race meant only for men. She showed up on a mule, claimed it was her speed demon, and took off in the wrong direction. She still finished second, though mostly because the first place horse threw its rider and ran into a pond. But beneath the mess, something raw and real remained. Jane wasn't trying to be disruptive. She was trying to stay visible, in a world that forgets women the moment they stop being useful. Jane refused to vanish quietly. She talked too loud, drank too deep, laughed too hard, so people remembered her, and somehow, she kept doing good in the middle of it. You hear about her dragging a miner with a crushed leg 6 miles to a doctor. About her giving away her last coin to feed someone else's child. About her threatening to shoot a shopkeeper who shorted a widow on bread. Not exactly the behavior of your average town drunk. There's one particularly sharp memory. Jane stumbling across a woman who'd collapsed outside the general store. Sunstroke, they figured. Jane picks her up, lifts her, despite being half the size, and hauls her into the shade. She fans the woman with her own hat, pours her last inch of water into the woman's mouth, and says softly, "Come on now, you don't die on my watch." She doesn't even wait for thanks. Just slips back into the saloon like nothing happened. But the saloons weren't kind to Jane either. She was too unpredictable, too loud, too much. Bartenders banned her, then unbanned her when someone got shot and needed her steady hands. The cycle never stopped. She was the town's paradox. Their shame, their pride. Some say she thrived on the attention. Others say it crushed her. You can see both in her eyes, flashes of joy followed by hollow silence. Like laughter that stops just short of a sob. And the people, they talked. Oh, how they talked. Calamity Jane, she's lost it. She was a hero once. Poor woman, she ought to be locked up. But no one really helped. They just watched, as we so often do when someone spins out in public. And maybe that's what stings the most. Not the drinking, not the rumors, but the loneliness wrapped in spectacle. You see her now, slumped against the saloon's outer wall, hat over her eyes, breathing slow. Her boots are untied. One sock's missing. There's a smear of blood on her sleeve. Old. Not hers. She mumbles something about Buffalo Bill, then dozes off mid-sentence. A child tiptoes past, drops a blanket over her knees. Jane doesn't wake up. You don't know if this is rock bottom or just another Tuesday. But somehow, she'll rise again tomorrow, cursing the sun, asking for coffee, and fixing someone's broken wagon wheel before lunch. That's Jane. Too much, too soon, too often, and still, always, showing up. Even when she shouldn't have to. The curtain lifts, and there she is. Not in a saloon this time. Not in a tent or a stinking army camp. This stage is real, with painted backdrops, gaslights flickering above, and an audience that paid good money to see her. They don't know what they're in for. Calamity Jane, the frontierswoman of legend, walks out in front of a velvet curtain wearing buckskins and a crooked smile. She waves. The crowd claps uncertainly, and for a moment, you can almost hear her heart beat louder than the applause. Because this isn't a battlefield or a trail camp or even Deadwood. This is show business. Jane, reluctantly or not, has become a performer. It's the 1890s now. She's older, rougher, less feared, more whispered about. The Wild West is dying, or being rebranded for sale. And there's a new economy taking shape. Nostalgia. People want stories of gunfighters and outlaws, savages and scouts. They want romance, danger, adventure, but sanitized. Nothing too real, nothing that smells like death or regret. And Jane, she smells like both, but she plays along. Buffalo Bill Cody invites her into his touring show. She's a living legend, after all, at least on paper. The woman who saved soldiers, rode with generals, outdrank sheriffs, and buried half of Deadwood with her bare hands. That Jane sells tickets. She doesn't get top billing. That goes to the sharp-eyed Annie Oakley and the stoic native warriors reenacting Custer's last stand for East Coast audiences who've never seen a prairie in their lives. But Jane, she's real. She brings texture, grit, the kind of authenticity that makes people lean in a little closer. Just in case she starts yelling. Historians still argue whether Jane ever really fit in the Buffalo Bill circuit. She performed with them briefly. Yes, but whether it was a contractual stint, a pity gig, or a short-lived stunt to draw crowds is unclear. She didn't last long, not because she lacked charisma, but because Jane didn't scripted. She'd stumble on stage drunk, tell the wrong story, or throw in a personal insult about the mayor of Omaha. Once, during a supposed reenactment of a frontier rescue, she turned to the attacking bandits and shouted, "Hell, I shot real ones uglier than you." The audience loved it. The producers, not so much. Here's your quirky tidbit. In one show, she reportedly refused to ride a stage horse because he looked like he'd complain if a lady sat down too fast. She then insisted on riding a mule from the props department. The mule did not behave. And yet, she had something, a weird, slouching magnetism. You couldn't look away. She wasn't pretty, she wasn't polished, but she was undeniably her. The realness bled through everything. Still, she didn't last in the big leagues. Eventually, she drifted into smaller shows, local vaudeville acts, poorly lit stages in mining towns, and backroom theaters where half the audience was asleep or drunk and the other half just wanted to see someone fall off a chair. Jane was fine with that. As long as there was a bit of food, a bottle, and someone to listen, she'd perform, tell the old stories, embellish where necessary, skip the parts that still hurt. You watch her now from backstage, hat in hand, leaning on a prop barrel that's more stable than she is. Her monologue drifts between sharp memory and muddy nonsense. She recounts an ambush that might never have happened, describes Wild Bill's last words in 3 different versions, each more dramatic than the last. But when the lights hit her just right, and she catches the breath between ramble and memory, you hear the truth. She believes it, or wants to, and maybe that's the whole point of the stage, to make the world kinder through a few altered details. Jane's audiences came for the spectacle, but some stayed for the ache. They didn't know what to do with her. She wasn't Annie Oakley, sleek, talented, composed. Jane was the opposite, unpredictable, ragged, and never quite sure if the applause was for her or the character people had invented around her. One night, she tries to perform a duet with a pianist who's never heard of her. Halfway through the story, she forgets her lines, stares out into the crowd, and whispers, "Do you think he sees me?" No one answers. You don't know if she means Wild Bill, or God, or just some lost part of herself. There's a sadness to her show days, a kind of sideways dignity, chipped and faded. She's not trying to fool anyone anymore, just to stay relevant, to matter, to not disappear, because the frontier is closing. Railroads are knitting the country together. Cowboys are going extinct. Outlaws are being replaced by bank managers. And Calamity Jane, who once outran posses and nursed the dying, is now struggling to hold her audience's attention between coughing fits. She's still got that voice, though, gravel dipped in bourbon, and when she bellows a punchline or growls at a heckler, you remember who she was. But it doesn't last. Backstage, you find her asleep on a crate, hat over her eyes, a ragged journal tucked under one arm. In it, she's written half a letter to someone named Jane Jr., a daughter no one can prove existed. The letter trails off mid-sentence. You're not surprised. She wakes, grins, and asks if you've got any chewing tobacco. You don't. She laughs anyway, because that's the thing about Jane. She always expects disappointment, and meets it with a shrug and a joke. She's a dying ember of a world no one wants to admit is gone. A legend trying to make rent. A sharpshooter who missed the final train west. But when she steps on that rickety stage, and the light hits her just right, and someone claps a little too hard in the second row, she straightens her spine, and for one more minute, she matters. You turn the page of a tattered newspaper, and there she is again. Calamity Jane causes scene in Leadville saloon. Woman scout drunk again, terrorizes stagecoach depot. Frontier madwoman or misunderstood heroine. The headlines never quite agree, but they all have one thing in common: they sell. In the 1880s and 90s, the name Calamity Jane is inked into every frontier rag and penny press story west of the Mississippi. She's not just a person anymore, she's content. A walking headline, a guaranteed eye-catcher, especially when the truth is optional. You sit in a smoky room, the type where editors puff cigars and invent scandal on slow news days. One of them smirks and says, "Let's say she's marrying a railroad tycoon next week. People love a redemption arc." Jane, meanwhile, is just trying to buy bread. She doesn't control the narrative anymore. If she ever did, what started as tall tales spun by her own whiskey-warm tongue has now become a runaway myth machine. And the worst part, even she can't always tell what's real. Historians still argue whether Jane willingly fed the press, or whether the press simply picked her bones clean. In reality, it was probably both. She told stories, wild, unverified, and unforgettable. The newspapers turned them into circus posters. She needed attention. They needed copy. Mutual exploitation. Frontier style. You read her name so often, it starts to blur. One week she's a hero. The next, a drunk who threatened to burn down a hotel. Then suddenly, she's being celebrated for saving a child from a bear, though no one quite remembers where or when that happened, or if it was even a bear. And Jane, she reads these clippings like holy scripture, keeps them folded in her coat pocket, worn thin from fingers and rain. She'll wave one around in a saloon, slurring, "See, they know me, I did things." And she did. But now those things are being rewritten faster than she can drink. One New York paper calls her the female Wild Bill. Another claims she once led a charge against a Sioux war party wielding 2 pistols and an axe. Jane doesn't deny it. Sometimes she even adds details. There were 3 axes. She grins, 1 in each boot. Quirky tidbit. A Kansas tabloid once published a Calamity Jane diet plan, supposedly based on her frontier lifestyle. It included whiskey, squirrel meat, and fistfuls of unfiltered truth. Jane had nothing to do with it, but someone made money off the pamphlet. Even when she's nowhere near the town, her legend shows up. Fights she didn't start, fires she didn't light, deeds she couldn't possibly have done, but they sound like her. So people believe them anyway. She's not a person, she's a template. You start to wonder, if someone becomes a myth while still alive, does that kill who they were? Or do they just slowly disappear behind the curtain? Jane tried once, just once, to set the record straight. She released a pamphlet called Life and Adventures of Calamity Jane, by herself. It was rambling, half-true at best, and clearly dictated to someone with a better sense of punctuation. But it was hers, or close to it. In it, she claims marriage to Wild Bill, motherhood, military honors, a tragic love story. Most of it is unverifiable. Some of it's impossible, but it's not the facts she's selling. It's the version of herself she wants you to see. A woman who loved fiercely, fought bravely, drank deeply, and meant well. And maybe that's the truest version of all. You watch her now, sitting on a bench outside a depot, reading her own newspaper clipping aloud to a confused child. Her voice rises with pride as she stumbles over the printed words, Calamity Jane. The frontier's wild rose, known for her sharp aim and sharper tongue. She doesn't care that the story is fake. She wants it to be true, needs it to be, because the real stories, about fever tents and sleepless nights and loneliness so thick it could choke you, those don't make headlines. They don't sell. So instead, she becomes the article, the fiction, the woman whose life was too strange for truth. So it had to become entertainment. And the townspeople, they read every word. Some scoff, some laugh, a few nod solemnly, like remembering a relative they couldn't quite explain. But they all read, because she's still the most interesting thing west of boredom. Even when she's not in town. Even when she's lying on a cot in a railcar, coughing blood into her scarf. Even when she's broken and still somehow muttering, I was somebody, damn it, she was, and is. You look at her now, aging fast. Too fast, ink-stained fingers tracing the headlines that mock and praise her in equal measure. Her breath wheezes, her hat's lost again, and someone just called her, has been, within earshot. She turns, smiles, better than a never was. Because if Jane knew anything, it was this, better to be talked about, twisted into myth, smeared and misremembered, than forgotten. The press never left her alone, but they also never let her disappear. And when the final curtain falls, that might be the only kind of immortality she ever asked for. The wheels clatter under your feet. A train cuts through the prairie, steam hissing like a tired old snake. You sway with the motion, watching dry grass blur past the window. And just across the aisle, Calamity Jane sits slumped against the seat, dozing with her mouth open and one boot still muddy from a town she left 2 days ago. You're traveling with her now, not in a wagon, not on horseback, but by iron rail, because that's the world she lives in, changing. Gone are the cavalry caravans and buffalo herds. Now it's timetables, conductors, and telegrams. Civilization has arrived, dragging polished shoes and paperwork behind it. And Jane, she's not quite built for it. She rides the rails like a ghost nobody invited, bouncing between towns. Never staying long. Sometimes she joins a Wild West show. Sometimes she just lingers near the train stations, telling stories to anyone who'll buy her a drink or hand her a coin. Her clothes are ragged, her voice, rougher than ever, but that spark in her eyes, it still flickers. Barely. Historians still argue whether Jane was purposefully drifting at this point, or simply had nowhere left to go. She burned bridges, sure, but a lot of those bridges were rotting to begin with. What's clear is that her fame and her reality were headed in opposite directions. In the public eye, she was still the gun-slinging nurse of Deadwood, the woman who buried the dead and barked at bandits. But in real life, Jane was aging out of her myth. And fame, as it turns out, doesn't pay for train fare. She'd sometimes offer to tell stories on a stagecoach for tips, or sell autographs on torn scraps of paper, even if they just said, Jane, in half-legible chicken scratch. Other times, she'd offer to cook, or clean, or sweep the floor for a chance to sleep indoors. But always, she carried her legend like luggage. Heavy, half-true, impossible to put down. There's a stretch of years where her name flickers in and out of town records across the Dakota Territories. Montana, Nebraska. Her trail is like spilled whiskey, messy, unpredictable, but always heading somewhere. One week she's working in a boarding house kitchen. The next, she's arrested for public drunkenness in Helena. Then she's back on stage in a shabby tent show outside Omaha, telling tall tales to a half-interested crowd. And every time someone recognizes her, she smiles like it still means something. Quirky tidbit. In one tiny railroad town in Wyoming, Jane reportedly gave an impromptu lecture at a ladies' temperance meeting, while drunk. She tried to convince them she'd given up liquor for good, then hiccuped and asked if anyone had any holy punch under the table. They didn't, but someone gave her a biscuit and a place to sleep. It wasn't all laughs, though. The more the railroad expanded, the smaller the frontier became. The places Jane once ruled, muddy streets, lonely hills, untamed towns, they were getting swallowed by maps and laws and churches with fresh paint. The world was shrinking, and Jane didn't shrink with it. Sometimes she tried to clean up. She swore off whiskey more than once, took jobs as a laundress, even wore dresses occasionally, though they never fit right, and she always ended up ripping them while trying to climb a fence or wrangle a mule. She'd get a few weeks of calm, maybe even a roof over her head. Then someone, would remind her she was Calamity Jane. And back she'd go, to the bottle, to the railcars, to the chaos that felt more like home than any quiet porch ever could. You ride with her now through a town that barely notices. She doesn't command the awe she once did. Young men glance at her and mutter. Kids don't know her name unless their grandmothers do. She mutters something about Buffalo Bill's circus, then falls asleep with a newspaper over her face. It's heartbreaking, sure, but also kind of heroic. Because she never quit, never gave up the story. She kept showing up, telling people who she was, reminding the world that once, just once, she mattered. And if she had to stretch the truth a little to keep the memory alive, so be it. She wasn't trying to be accurate. She was trying to be remembered. You stop in a town called Terry. It's barely a dot on the map. But Jane hops off the train anyway. Says she knows someone there. Or knew someone. Or used to owe someone a drink. You lose track of the details. She lingers at the depot, staring at the hills. There's gold in 'em still, they say, but she doesn't look interested in that. She's thinking about something else. Maybe Wild Bill. Maybe Deadwood. Maybe the hundreds of faces she never got to say goodbye to. And for a second, she's still. No story, no performance. Just a woman with windburned cheeks and coal-used hands, staring into a sky that used to feel a lot bigger. She doesn't belong here. Not really. But she's here anyway. Still on the move. Still showing up. Still refusing to vanish. And when the train pulls away, she waves. Not at you. Just at the tracks. Like she's saying goodbye to a version of herself she can't carry anymore. The house is small. Crooked door. Soot-streaked windows. You'd walk right past it if you didn't know who was inside. Calamity Jane, spooning weak stew into the mouth of a little girl with wide eyes and a cough that doesn't quit. She doesn't look like a sharpshooter right now. No rifle, no bravado, just a worn shirt, a fraying braid, and hands that tremble slightly when she thinks no one's looking. But she's focused, gentle. You watch her wipe the girl's chin with a ragged edge of her sleeve and whisper something soft. So soft it almost sounds like singing. Wait, is she singing? It's the closest thing to tenderness you've seen from her, and it makes you wonder, who was she, really, when no one else was watching? Because this isn't a newspaper story. This isn't a show. This is personal. Whispers have followed Jane for decades. Rumors of a daughter, a child she never named aloud unless she'd had too much to drink. In some towns, she claimed to have given birth after Wild Bill's death. In others, she said she gave the baby up to save her from the shame of her life. But names, dates, records, they don't add up. Historians still argue whether Calamity Jane ever had a child. There are no official documents, no birth certificate, no confirmed adoption, just scattered letters, inconsistent stories, and a single girl in some of those stories, Jane Jr., she's sometimes called, who may have existed. Or may have been entirely fictional. But here's what you see now. Jane caring for a child like a mother would. Not like a nurse, not like a show woman, like someone who knows what it's like to be small and scared and alone. And whether the girl is her child or not, Jane acts like she is. She moves in and out of roles like that. One day she's swearing at a conductor. The next she's sewing up a torn dress for a neighbor's daughter. Sometimes she'll take in orphans for a few weeks, sharing her food, her bedroll, her stories. Then she'll vanish, off to the next town, to another job, another bottle. Quirky tidbit, once in Miles City, Montana, Jane was seen dragging a goat behind her, claiming it was a gift for my girl. The goat, apparently, bit a banker and ate his hat before Jane got it tied up. No one ever saw the girl, but the goat stayed tied behind the saloon for 3 weeks. Was she making it all up? Maybe, but if you listen to her talk about that daughter, her voice changes. It gets lower, warmer, almost hesitant, like she's holding something delicate she doesn't trust herself with. She'll say things like, "She had my eyes," or, "She could ride before she could walk." No photos, no graves, no proof, but maybe not everything needs proof. Sometimes, believing is the only thing holding a person together. You learn about one particular letter she wrote late in life, addressed to, "My dear little girl," begging forgiveness, saying she wasn't strong enough to stay, that she wanted her daughter to grow up clean, away from whiskey and wanted posters. The letter was found folded in her coat pocket after she died. No one knows if it was ever sent. And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it was just enough for her to write it. Because Jane didn't get to be soft very often. She was always fighting something, the elements, the men, the memories. So when you see her now, rocking a child to sleep in the crook of her arm, humming a lullaby that's more breath than melody, you remember that she was more than the chaos. She was care, too. Sometimes you find traces of that child. Rumors of a woman in California who claimed to be Jane's daughter. Her name was Jessie, and she said Jane left her in the care of a foster family when she was just a baby. Jessie even showed off a few trinkets, a locket, a signed Bible, but even she admitted she wasn't sure which parts were true. Because memory is slippery, especially when it comes from someone who made her living exaggerating. Still, there's something about the way Jane told it. The same story, over and over, a daughter, a better life, a chance she never had. She painted that picture so vividly. You can't help but believe some part of it was real. You want it to be real. Not just for Jane, but for yourself. Because if even she could have something that's soft, that hopeful, maybe the world isn't quite as cruel as it pretends to be. She once told a friend, "I've done more wrong than right. But I tried hard. I tried to love when I could." And that's all you see now. A woman past her prime. Exhausted, unshaven, clothes worn thin, but rocking a child to sleep with the kind of gentleness that doesn't lie. She wasn't the mother the frontier expected. But she was the one it got. And for that one girl, whoever she was, Jane might have been the whole world for a while. A walking legend. A lullaby in boots. A broken woman with enough room in her arms to hold someone else's future. And if that's not motherhood, what is? The wind howls low through the alleyways of a mining town whose name most people never bothered to learn. You step carefully, boots sinking into layers of mud and ash, until you spot her again, slouched against a post, passing a tin cup to a gaunt man who looks like he hasn't eaten in 3 days. Calamity Jane doesn't say anything clever this time. Just watches him drink, then she nods once and moves on, like it's just another task on a long list that no one ever wrote down. This is the side of her story most folks never heard. Not the shooter, not the brawler, not the so-called female Wild Bill. This is Jane, the caretaker of strangers. She walks into places others won't. The brothels behind the brothels. The plague shacks. The boarding houses where old prospectors go to die without anyone left to miss them. She knocks. She enters. She helps. No papers. No parades. Just quiet, messy, human things. And she does it over and over and over again. Historians still argue whether this phase of her life was rooted in guilt or grace. Was she trying to make amends? Did she feel responsible for something? Bill's death? Lost siblings? Maybe even that phantom daughter? Or was this who she'd always been beneath the noise? Someone who couldn't not care? Maybe you don't need an answer, because the result is the same. There's a story from Butte, Montana, a mining camp riddled with pneumonia one winter. The whole street shut down. People too scared to go inside. Except Jane. She waded in with whiskey, bandages, and some concoction she swore was prairie medicine, mostly onion stew and boiled willow bark. 4 lived. 3 died. Jane buried all of them. When she walked out, no one cheered, but a little boy standing nearby saluted her. She saluted back, and that was it. Quirky tidbit. According to one onlooker in Deadwood, Jane once rescued a sheep that had fallen into a frozen pond. She was drunk at the time, wearing only one boot, and cursing the sheep in 3 languages as she hauled it out. Then she gave it her coat. "Damn thing's got more sense than most men," she muttered. This was her pattern in those later years. Not fame, not money, but acts of unseen mercy. She gave away her food, her bedding, sometimes even her coat, slept outside so someone else could sleep inside, told lies to help people keep their dignity. "Oh, I found this loaf of bread," she'd say, after buying it with the last coin in her boot heel. There's a boarding house operator in Lead who said Jane would sneak in at night, scrub the floors, then disappear before dawn. When asked why, she shrugged, figured it'd make the morning quieter. She never asked for payment. But she did sometimes ask for stories, sat by the bedsides of dying men and listened, really listened, while they told her about wives they missed, horses they lost, sons they'd never meet. She'd nod, maybe hold their hand, then promise, "I'll remember for you," and she did. You start to think Jane was less a person and more a roaming memory keeper. A woman who collected the forgotten, held them for a moment, then let them go with a kind of reverence that no church could match. But even saints get tired. Jane's health wasn't great by this point. Tuberculosis stalked her ribs like a shadow. Her cough grew deep, cracked. Her weight dropped. She still drank, though not as much. Maybe she couldn't afford it. Maybe she just didn't need the escape anymore. Because there was no hiding from this version of life. This was the bare truth. No stage lights. No applause. Just hard nights, colder mornings, and the quiet gratitude of those who had nothing else to give her but a nod. Still, the townsfolk rarely said thank you. Some mocked her, others pitied her. A few, the smarter ones, offered her coffee and left the door unlocked. She never stayed long. It was like she knew her presence was temporary, like she was a moving ember, just enough to warm a room, but not meant to last there. The word kindness doesn't feel big enough for what she did. It wasn't gentle, it was gritty, sharp-edged, exhausting, but real. That's the thing no one teaches you about care. It's not always pretty. Sometimes it's ugly, loud, desperate. Sometimes it's someone holding your hair back while you vomit, or dragging you off a freezing street because you passed out with your boots on wrong. Jane knew that, lived it, and through it all, she remembered. She'd recall names no one else did. That old-timer, name was Harris, fought at Shiloh, loved pickled eggs, had 2 wives, neither worth spit. It'd make people laugh, or cry, or both. She gave people back their own stories when they'd forgotten them. And what did she get in return? A few warm meals, some clumsy affection, the knowledge that for all the chaos she carried, she had made herself useful, if not always loved. You find her now at the edge of another mining town, sitting on the back stoop of a church. She's got a Bible on her lap, though she's not reading it, just holding it like it might remember something she doesn't. There's a child leaning against her shoulder, half asleep, wrapped in Jane's scarf. She glances at you, smiles. Tired of being trouble, she says, but I reckon I ain't done yet. And you believe her, because in a world that doesn't often reward tenderness, Jane kept giving it away anyway. Not for redemption, not for applause, but because someone had to. There's a chill in the air that feels different this time. Not the usual prairie breeze or the kind of bite you get from early snowfall. This one feels final, like the land itself knows something's ending. You find her in South Dakota. The town's called Terry, barely a handful of buildings and more ghosts than people. Calamity Jane has slowed down. Her steps are shorter. Her eyes don't wander like they used to. They settle more now. Staring too long at nothing. Like she's playing back a memory no one else can see. She's sick. Not the kind of sick whiskey or grit can cure. This is deeper. The coughing fits have gotten worse. Her breath comes like she's fighting for it. Her shoulders, once squared like a gunfighter's, slump more each day. Jane knows. She doesn't talk about it much, except in half jokes. Got a hitch in my lungs. She mutters. Doc says I should quit the booze. Told him I'd rather quit the doc. But there's a weariness in her bones that wasn't there before. You see it in how she ties her boots. How she folds her hands before meals. How she watches the sky like it might forget her name. She's staying at the Callaway Hotel now. In a small, worn room with a single bed, a cracked mirror, and a view of a hill that no longer offers gold. Just silence. The owners let her stay on charity. Or maybe out of reverence. Or maybe pity. It's all the same to Jane. Some say she spent her final days in a drunken blur. Others say she had moments of clarity, even peace. Historians still argue whether she died with regret or relief. Her letters from this time, if you can find them, hint at both. She writes one to a friend. It reads, I never meant to be famous. Just didn't want to be forgotten. Hope I made you laugh. Hope I didn't make too many cry. You sit with her one evening. She's too tired to talk. Just hums something low, something you don't recognize. Her hands, though weathered and swollen, are still strong. She pats your arm. Dewine ain't as hard as people think. She says quietly, it's the part before that that really takes the fight out of you. Quirky tidbit, in those last weeks, she asked to be buried in a new dress. Not because she cared about appearances, but because it was one of the few things she'd never done, wear something fresh. A friend from Deadwood brought it. Soft fabric, pale color, didn't suit her at all. She wore it anyway. On August 1st, 1903, Martha Jane Canary passed away in that little room. Some say she died peacefully in her sleep. Others claim she was talking to herself when she stopped mid-sentence. A few even say she was laughing. There were no crowds, no band, no heroic sunset, just a quiet departure from a world that had never known quite what to do with her. She was 51, give or take. Her birth date was as slippery as her stories. They prepared her body with care, washed her, brushed her hair, laid her gently in a pine coffin with a few of her belongings, a pair of warm gloves, a hand-rolled cigarette, and, depending on who tells it, a faded photograph of Wild Bill. Yes, even in death, that name stayed close. And here's the twist you didn't expect. She got buried right beside him. Wild Bill Hickok, the man she loved, or chased, or imagined, depends on who you ask. They buried her next to him in Mount Moriah Cemetery in Deadwood. Not by coincidence. Some say it was her dying wish. Others claim the townsfolk did it as a cruel joke, thinking Bill wouldn't have wanted her there. Either way, she's there. And maybe that's fitting. She followed him in life. Now she'd follow him in death. Whether or not he ever truly saw her, she saw him, and for someone like Jane, who was rarely seen clearly by anyone, that meant something. Her funeral wasn't grand. A few people came. Some cried. Some smirked. Some just stood in silence, wondering what she had been to them. A friend. A burden. A legend. No one really knew, but they all remembered her. Even now, decades after, you can stand on that hill and read the marker. Martha Jane Canary, Calamity Jane, 1852 to 1903. No poetry, no epigraph, just the name. You imagine her now, boots off, hat over her eyes, resting finally, no trains, no show crowds, no drunks yelling her name for a story, just the wind, the pines, and whatever comes next. For all the fire she carried, her final days were quiet. She didn't go out with a bang, she just faded. But that doesn't make her ending any less powerful. Sometimes the wildest storms leave behind the calmest skies. You stand on a hill where the grass doesn't care who's buried underneath it. Mount Moriah Cemetery, Deadwood, South Dakota, a place carved into the rock like a stubborn memory. The graves are old, the paths wind like the lives that ended here. And there, side by side, under the soft hush of pine needles and wind, lie Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane, two names that never did fit into any single truth. You look at the markers. His is simple, hers matching, together in stone, just as she always said they would be. But the story behind that pairing, it's tangled. Jane didn't choose to be buried here. Not directly. She was dead by the time the town made the call. And here's the part they don't put in history books. They buried her next to Wild Bill as a joke. Not a tribute, not a final reunion, a joke. You see, some townsfolk didn't believe her stories. They thought her obsession with Bill was delusional. Her claims of marriage a whiskey-soaked fantasy. So when she died, a few decided it would be funny to place her beside the man who likely never returned her affections. A final insult, a prank in stone. Quirky, yes. Cruel, arguably, but the result, strangely poetic. Historians still argue whether Bill and Jane ever had any real connection. He was married to someone else, and kept his personal life mostly private. There's no record of love letters, no photos of the two together that aren't staged. Some say they barely spoke beyond a few casual encounters. Others swear she protected him, traveled with him, even saved his life once. But Jane's version of the story endured. She loved him, she said, fiercely, blindly, maybe foolishly, and whether or not he ever returned that feeling, well, you're standing at his grave now. And she's lying 6 feet away. That counts for something. Maybe it doesn't matter if it started as a joke. Maybe fate has a way of tidying up the ledger. Because now, tourists come to see the pair. Not just Wild Bill, not just Jane. They're a duo, whether history approves or not. And in a strange twist, being buried next to him might be the most famous thing Jane ever did. Which is wild. After everything she lived through, wars, smallpox, sharpshooting, stage shows, mercy, mayhem, it's the grave that gets the attention. But that's the way legends work. You don't get to control what people remember. The graveyard itself doesn't say much. There's a small fence around the site now. A tourist plaque with a sanitized version of their stories. You won't find the contradictions there. You won't read about the hangovers or the heartbreak or the fact that Jane once slept under a pile of laundry because she'd given her bed to a sick stranger. But you can feel her here. Not in the stone. Exactly. In the air. In the stubborn way the wind pushes against your collar. In the way the pine branches seem to lean toward each other like gossiping neighbors. There's a stillness on this hill. But not a peace. Not exactly. It's more like a pause. Like Jane might sit up at any moment, brush off the dust, and start complaining about the view. I asked to be buried near the outhouse. Not the legend. She'd mutter. You almost wish she would. And here's the thing. They may not have been lovers. But they were both outsiders. Misfits. Restless spirits in a world trying to box them in. Jane, the wild woman with a rifle and a cracked heart. Bill, the gambler with a fast draw and a fatal seat at a poker table. Maybe that's the link. Not romance. Resonance. They lived fast, died strange, left behind stories that don't quite fit. And now, they're linked forever, in granite and in gossip. Some people leave behind buildings, inventions, empires. Jane left behind a question. Was she his wife? A liar? A guardian? A woman clinging to something that made her feel whole? The answer might be yes to all of it. Or none. But here's what you do know. She wanted to be remembered. And she is. She outlasted the doubters. Outlived the mockery. And now, every time someone steps onto this hill and reads those names, she wins. Because she's not a footnote, not a prop in Bill's story. She's got her own name, her own grave, her own mystery, and she's not moving. You run your fingers over the carving in the stone. Martha Jane Canary. Calamity Jane. There's no quote, no scripture, just a name. She didn't need more. She was more. And now she lies beside the man she chased across towns and through stories. Whether it was love or obsession, you'll never know for sure. But you do know this. She made it. In the end, she's still standing in history. Weather-beaten, complicated, unforgettable, just like she always wanted. The world moved on, but Jane never quite left it. Even now, more than a century since she took her last breath in that musty South Dakota room, Calamity Jane refuses to stay buried. Not in memory, not in myth. She lingers, in books, in films, in stories whispered across prairie winds and YouTube playlists. She never had a home in life, but in legend. She's built an empire. You turn on a screen, and there she is, played by actresses with glittering eyes and perfect teeth. Usually wearing a corset Jane would have used to patch a wagon wheel. In musicals, she sings. In westerns, she smirks. In children's stories, she becomes a quirky role model with a lasso and a heart of gold. It's cute, entertaining, but not quite her. The real Calamity Jane didn't dance. She stumbled. She didn't sing. She howled. She didn't ride off into sunsets. She woke up in ditches and still somehow helped strangers get back on their feet. And that version of her, it's harder to market. Historians still argue whether she deserves more credit, or less. Some claim she inflated every story she ever told. That she was a drunken grifter who got lucky with timing. Others say she was a feminist icon long before the term existed. A woman who carved her own path through a country determined to keep her on her knees. And here's the tricky part. They're both right. Because Jane wasn't just a person. She was an accumulation, 1,000 small contradictions wrapped in one muddy, coughing, whip-smart body. She bragged and she blurred the truth. But she also showed up, again and again, not for applause, but because someone needed her. And maybe that's the real measure of a legend. Not the size of the story, but the consistency of the choice. Will you show up, even when it's hard, even when you're not the hero, even when no one claps? Jane did. Again and again. Quirky tidbit. In the mid-20th century, someone tried to name a perfume after her. Calamity Scent. It flopped. Turns out the world wasn't ready to associate a woman who smelled like sweat, horses, and black coffee with floral undertones. But the irony isn't lost on you. Because Jane never wanted to be pretty. She wanted to be remembered. And she got her wish. You find her in the margins of every cowboy tale. You see her in every girl who refuses to sit still. You hear her voice in every woman who doesn't say sorry for being loud, or messy, or too much. And her story, raw, crooked, human, keeps shifting. Because we keep shifting, too. In the 1950s, she was reinvented as a comedic heroine. In the 1990s, she became a dusty feminist icon. In modern media, she swings somewhere between outlaw and caretaker, unhinged and unbreakable, but always there, always undeniable, no matter how many layers we wrap around her, no matter how polished we try to make her boots or how clean we scrub her language. The core truth sticks. She was more than a sharpshooter, more than a drunk, more than a myth stitched together by men who didn't know what to do with her. She was grief and grit and grace and gall. She was tender and terrifying. And maybe the most terrifying thing about her, she didn't ask for permission. You sit with that now. Under a slow sky, the wind hushes, like it's listening. Maybe it is. Maybe Jane's still walking somewhere just outside the edge of what we can explain. She left behind no fortune, no great political moment, no clean legacy, just stories. And maybe that's the best kind of immortality. Because a clean legacy is easy to forget. But a messy one, that sticks. She sticks. Always will. So now, the fire has dimmed, the moon is high, and the last sounds of the prairie fade into hush. You've walked beside her, through dust storms and broken towns, past fevered sickbeds and drunken saloons. You've seen the sharpness in her laugh and the softness in her silence. You felt the truth of someone who never had much, but still gave more than most. And maybe, in some small way, Calamity Jane gave a piece of herself to you too. Her story doesn't tie up neatly. It frays at the edges. It rattles a bit, like a wagon wheel that's seen too many miles. But maybe that's what makes it last. Because in a world that demands perfection, she offered persistence. In a world that applauds polish, she gave us dirt under her nails and honesty in her bones. So let her stay with you, just a little longer, when your path feels uncertain, when the world asks you to be quieter, smaller, easier to explain. Let Jane lean in, light a match, and say, "Well, kid, they ain't seen nothin' yet. Now exhale, let the weight fall off your shoulders. Let the wind wrap around you like an old friend. You've done enough for today." She'd say the same. "Thanks for wandering through the wild with me. Sleep well, you've earned it."